Shields and swords, field of wars, fighting my blood, down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
So before talking about King Arthur or doing any kind of King Arthur, I think we need to address the big elephant in the room. And that is the question of whether or not King Arthur was a real historical figure. Now, maybe you never thought about that. Maybe you never questioned it. Maybe you always assumed he was fictional or always assumed that he was a historic figure. But I would say from my experience, I don't know, maybe 20% of the students I have in a class when I'm teaching about King Arthur are very interested in this subject. They're very interested in knowing, was King Arthur real? They want to write their research papers on this, which I always ban as a subject. I will not allow my students to write about that for reasons that will become clear later on. So first, let me start with just sort of setting the table. I don't think in any meaningful way, that meaningful will be important later on, that King Arthur was a real person. I don't think that that's the case. But beyond all that, I don't think any of that is even meaningful when we're dealing with the legend of King Arthur. So what we'll often see is people trying to pore through old books and try to find, like, well, what is the, maybe I could find someone whose name was Arturius, or someone who had this element or that element of King Arthur, and try to find the kind of origins of this. But the truth is that King Arthur is not really, in any important way for us today, a person. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, there's two things. The first one is this idea that King Arthur is not so much a character, but a setting. I was introduced to this by the great Elizabeth Sklar, who argued that when you look at Arthurian legend, very few of them are about King Arthur himself. They're almost all about other knights of other knights. I was about to say of the Round Table. Some of them aren't even about the Round Table, who are in his orbit. And he acts as a kind of setting, so you immediately know, this is the world that we are in. And so I think that that's really accurate. I mean, when you start to think about what you know about Arthurian legend, very little of it is about King Arthur. So many Arthurian legends begin with, Arthur was meeting with his knights and said, all right, before we feast, someone tell us a story, and then the real story begins, right? So one thing is, I don't think that Arthurian legend ultimately tends to be about Arthur himself, right? It tends to be about the other people around him. But aside from all those things, what about still the question of historicity? Well, here's what it comes down to. What we think about as King Arthur is a fictional character. So let's take a thought experiment. Let's imagine that in, I don't know, we'll say the 3rd century. I'm just pulling up dates here. In the 3rd century, there was some guy, one of the Britons, who was a local leader who really inspired the people around him by promoting a kind of warrior code. Let's even go further on, say that guy's name was Arthur, or some Welsh version of that, or the Latin name that the Romans used for him was Arturius, or whatever the thing would be. Let's assume all that. Given all that, is that person who we think of as King Arthur? And I would argue it isn't. King Arthur is instead this legendary character who's been built upon and built upon and built upon and built upon over and over and over again. So, for example, one of the things that you see in Arthurian legend a lot over the last couple centuries is time travel narratives. time travel narratives where someone ends up in King Arthur's court, or occasionally someone who's a thinly warmed over version of a medieval person ends up in the modern world. This kind of and where this comes from is from Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, which part of his humor and his wry social commentary, ended up conflating these two worlds and putting them together. And it won't take you very long to see that about once every decade, there's a major motion picture, sometimes for adults, sometimes for children, sometimes a cartoon, whatever, that retells the story of a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, whether it's a kid in King Arthur's Court, an astronaut in King Arthur's Court, whatever the thing is. This is a thing which is now part of Arthurian legend, this time travel narrative of where we interact directly with King Arthur's Court. Well, Mark Twain wrote this in 1889, I think is when he published it, 89, right? He did not know any historical King Arthur. He never met King Arthur. He never met any of those people. All that stuff was over 1,000 years gone by the time he was even born. So can we then look at Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court and its whole huge part of Arthurian mythos and say, well, that doesn't count then? Well, of course not. Of course it counts. And if you want to pick a benchmark, let's think about Robin Hood. Robin Hood's another mythical figure from, the Middle Ages, songs and legends about him, et cetera, et cetera. He's much more about a character than a setting, but we'll take him anyway. Robin Hood. Can you think of any time travel narratives involving Robin Hood? There might be one, but I can't think of one where someone ends up, it would have to be very obscure, right? It's not a major part of what we think about with Robin Hood. Is people from the present traveling back and learning from the ideas of justice found among Robin Hood and Sherwood Forest and the Merry Men. That's not a thing that happens. Now, we do often have commentary on the present through this, but that's an anachronism, but that's pretty common in any kind of retelling of anything, anytime. So I would argue that Mark Twain creating this time travel narrative as part of Arthurian mythos has become a part of it and is just as much a part of it as anything that might have happened with this fictional person I made up in my head who lived, I forget when I said 3rd century maybe, a Briton who was a great local chieftain. So ultimately, if we could find somehow this person, this dude was the original Arthur right here. This doesn't account for all the other parts of Arthur that are just as legitimately part of Arthurian legend. And so aside from the fact that I personally kind of don't think that such a person exists, it's just kind of a snowball that's rolled along and picked up more things over time. Even if such a person exists, that's not who we're talking about. The King Arthur that I'll be talking about here on this channel, and I would recommend that when you think about it and you read King Arthur for pleasure or for study, that when you think about King Arthur, you think about him really as this kind of legendary figure, and think about what is the legend doing here in this particular retelling, whether it be a poem, a song, a novel, or a film.